Welcome back everyone to second part of Symposium, Food Innopolis International Symposium 2020. The next session will be shared about the impact of COVID-19 to the sustainable food system and the role of food and agriculture organizations in supporting their resilient food system.
And if any participants who has questions regarding to this topic, you can send them to us through Q&A box. I believe that our speaker will be pleased to answer all of them at the end of the session. We are honored to welcome another expert who will be presenting on this session, the Healthy and Sustainable Food System Overview. Please welcome Mr. Sridhar Dharmapuri, FAO Senior Food Safety and Nutrition Officer of Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Please welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. And I first of all would like to thank very much the organizers of the Food Innopolis International Symposium for inviting the Food and Agriculture Organization to speak at this important symposium. And the topic that you more or less outlined right up front when I see the brochure itself on the quest for the sustainable food system is indeed a very significant and a very important one, particularly at these times when we are still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic and we are still looking at how to respond and recover from its impacts, not only across all economies, but in particular on food systems and in agriculture in general, and how we need to recover from the pandemic so that we can then get back on the road to the SDGs. Now, the SDGs can only be achieved if we recover and recover well from the pandemic, and at the same time use this as an opportunity to redesign, reshape, and reimagine our food systems so that they're much more sustainable and resilient to future shocks. So that, in effect, is the title of my presentation today. As I've been introduced, I'm Sridhar. I look after the food safety and nutrition portfolio, as well as the agriculture and food systems program of the Regional Office for Asia and Pacific. We are based in Bangkok. We cover 46 countries in the region, and our region extends from Iran in the west, right across Asia up to the Pacific Islands. So we cover all these countries and are working with our counterparts in various ministries, particularly agriculture, as well as all the subsectors, such as crops, livestock, poultry, fisheries, as well as other important ministries such as climate change, on resilience, on social welfare and social protection, and many others. So if you can move to the next slide. Next slide, please. All right. So what I'm showing you here is our flagship publication, which comes out every year. This is the global overview of the state of food insecurity and food security and nutrition, which comes out from our headquarters in Rome. We have the regional version, which will come out very soon in the next month or so, where we'll focus more on Asia and the Pacific region. But to start this particular talk off, I'm going to first talk about what you actually see in the global overview. Next slide, please. So the key take-home messages from the global overview are as follows: that up to 10 million people up to 10 million more people are suffering from chronic hunger each year, and especially over the last 1 year. And there are nearly 60 million in the last 5 years. That's the actual rise. And if you look beyond just chronic hunger, we have 2 billion people who do not have regular access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food. And definitely the world is not on track to eradicate hunger or to achieve SDG 2 by 2030. If current trends continue, we would actually have more than 840 million by 2030. And the pandemic itself is probably going to add about 132 million people. That's the current estimate. So there's a serious threat to food security from COVID-19 itself as we go forward. And definitely, as I said, the world is not on track to defeat malnutrition. Next slide, please. And here what we actually see is a graphic representation, how hunger at first slowly was actually decreasing. but has now begun to increase once again. And very worryingly, it has begun to increase at at an accelerating rate. So you can actually see that from between the years 2015, which is when we actually had the Millennium Development Goals, and we set the Sustainable Development Goals, we actually begin to see a slow rate increase in the rate of acceleration in world hunger. And at this point, we have about 700 billion or 687, of which the majority, nearly about 55%, are in Asia. So if you go to the next slide, you will actually see the proportion of the hungry or the malnourished, or those who have a high percentage of undernourishment. Can we move to the next slide, please? So you can see that the proportion in Asia itself at this point is about 55%. And this, while it looks good that it will decrease by 2030 to about 40%, that's still an unacceptably high number. So we are right now in this background, and this was even before COVID actually hit us this year. So already things were going off track, and COVID has actually worsened the situation. And that you will see on the next slide, where you can see that with COVID, we would have been at around 695 million. But because of the impacts of the pandemic, and depending on the kind of scenarios that we actually have, you could actually have a total of more than 827 right now, or by the end of this year or early next year. Whereas we were initially projecting this number in 10 years' time by the end of 2030. So you can actually see that COVID-19 is actually adding the number of from 83 to 132 million to the total number of undernourished people in the world. And what we're here talking about is chronic hunger. So we're not talking about acute food insecurity, which can be at times be we can have relief to that. But chronic hunger needs much more longer term plans to be in place. Now, all this is taking place in the background that most of you would probably be more familiar than me, and that's on the next slide. And that is in the drop in growth rates of economies and job losses. Now, we all know that over the last 15, 20, probably even longer, for at least since the Asian crisis of 1997, over the last 23 years, this region has been one of the fastest growing in the world. We need to move to the next slide, please. Sorry. Right. So what I was telling you is that over the last 15 to 20 years, this region has been one of the fastest growing in the world. Economic growth rates have outpaced virtually every other region on Earth. And this has resulted in significant, as you saw, reduction in hunger and as well as reduction in poverty. However, because of COVID, we do see these projections. These are from the ADB. I'm sorry that it's not indicated on the slide, but it should be. So these are from the ADB, and you can see that there are significant decreases in GDP rates over the last few months, particularly because of the impact of COVID, and therefore the impact in terms of lockdowns and restrictions on work and businesses. So if you see on the next slide, one of the good things, fortunate things, let's say, that has actually happened is that there have not been many significant changes in domestic food prices. And that is because of the very good measures that have been taken by all the member governments in this region. So whether they are in terms of food security schemes, ensuring equitable distribution of food to the most vulnerable, or whether it's through social protection, that is through distribution of direct benefits, cash transfers, again to vulnerable people, ensuring that there is a basic cushion which people can use to get over the immediate shock of the COVID or the immediate lockdowns, and they have access to food security. So all these measures have actually helped countries to cushion the impact so far on the vulnerable populations. And some of the measures that have been taken to keep food systems functional, such as avoiding trade restrictions, ensuring green lanes, for example, for agriculture produce to move, ensuring facilities so that farmers can get to markets or the produce can get to markets, especially perishables, as well as ensuring availability of inputs such as seed, feed, fertilizer, etc. For the next agriculture season. All these have actually enabled food prices to remain stable. And on the next slide, you will see the stability also reflected in the various commodities that are commonly consumed. So in terms of, you will see that while there is some increase, even on the previous slide, these in terms of actual consumer price inflation are nominal. They are not very high considering the situation that we are in. So again, this is a credit to the governments in the region who have reacted strongly and well to prevent the situation from getting out of hand. On the next slide, you will see that these are some of the main, you can please keep clicking and have all the points on the screen. So here what you will see is some of the important impacts of this particular crisis. One is that compared to earlier crisis, agriculture is not, one is that job losses and the slowdown of economic growth will make access to food more difficult. So it's not production or food systems actually which are going to cause the impact on food security and nutrition, but the job losses and the reduction in economic access to food. Second is that compared to earlier crises, particularly as I said earlier, in the late 90s when we had the Asian financial crisis, agriculture is likely to play a reduced role in absorbing job loss. And why is that? Because agriculture now has a smaller share of the economy in most countries here in the region. It's more mechanized, so is employing lower and lower number of people. And then there is the question of migration from more rural areas to urban. And urban workers don't necessarily have the skills or the desire to work in agriculture. So this reduced income will make nutritious food less available, less affordable, especially for the poor. And some of the negative effects will unfortunately also be permanent. And so those are things that governments will have to deal with. So on the next slide, I'll show you what are the kind of policy measures that have actually been put in place to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. Some of these have been put in place. Some of these governments are being advised to put in place. So they're in various stages, but largely this is where most of the responses are. One is, of course, to control spread of the virus. We are in Thailand, and we can definitely see the strong restrictions that the government has placed, particularly on international travel, to ensure that there is no second wave or third wave, which some of the other countries are suffering from. And it's important that across food systems and supply chains, we implement all the health measures that are advocated for COVID. So hand hygiene, physical distancing, avoiding touching too many surfaces, the use of PPE, and so on and so forth. These are not very common, but now they all need to be put in place. The second is to expand social protection, especially for the poor and vulnerable. This has turned out to be one of the big measures that has been undertaken by governments in the last 6 or 7 months, and this needs to continue because the impact on the economy is going to continue. It's not going away very soon. So social protection, social safety nets need to continue. Then to have private and public cooperation to ensure that supply chain disruptions, whenever they occur, they are quickly solved. Because trade lines, supply chains, food systems need to be kept open and functional, and any obstacle needs to be quickly removed so that you don't have downstream effects. And then most important thing is, of course, to have more resilient and flexible food systems, which is a big lesson that we have learned from this pandemic. So just coming back on the next slide to where we are at the global level. The report from the State of Food Security and Nutrition actually shows that while there is progress on child stunting, on exclusive breastfeeding, other indicators such as wasting, child overweight, they are not improving. Adult obesity is on the rise. So what you see on those graphs there are the annual rate of reduction as well as the annual rate of increase in some cases. So all these figures actually show that we are definitely off track in respect to the SDGs. And therefore, we need to use the opportunity afforded by the COVID crisis to ensure that we actually come back on most countries in the region, come back on track to the SDGs. On the next slide, you will actually see the key issue related to nutrition is the fact that the cost of a healthy diet is increasing all the time. So An energy sufficient diet which meets short-term subsistence is the cheapest. In other words, as most people say, calories are cheap, nutrients are expensive. So more nutrients, the more expensive it is. And then on the next slide, what you will see is the difference between a recommendation of FAO that what we should actually be producing through agriculture and making available, or let's say what, it's the other way, sorry, is the how we should actually be eating according to Harvard's healthy eating plate model, and what according to FAO is actually being produced in the world. So you can see the mismatch. And the very obvious one that you can see is the fact that fruits and vegetables need to be about 50% of the diet according to the eating plate model, but we actually produce only 17% of what is required, whereas we actually produce 40% of cereals and starchy foods, which are the staples. And in many of the countries in the region, policies, agriculture policies, food policies are more skewed towards the production of cereals and starchy foods rather than fruits and vegetables. The other advantage of cereals and starches is, of course, that in many cases they can be easily exported, packaged, and exported, whereas fruit and vegetables being more perishable, they're actually more likely to have more food losses and waste along the chain because of their very nature. This is also true of other commodities such as fish, but definitely fruit and vegetables are the ones which actually need shorter chains and which can be locally produced and locally consumed. So these are issues that need to be taken up when we are looking at food systems. So on the next slide, what you see a general distribution globally, that more than 3 billion people in the world cannot actually afford a healthy diet. So this is an unfortunate reality. And on the next slide, you can actually see that these diets, or in fact, the current diets, has a hidden cost. We all know about the importance of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and particularly in terms of the Paris Agreement to reduce the proportion of emissions from agriculture. However, current food consumption, based on what we actually produce, what you saw on a couple of slides ago, actually promotes higher greenhouse gas emissions. And by adopting or actually having different diets, or actually having diets which are more relevant to the countries which we live in, including traditional diets, flexitarian diets, or vegetarian diets, or vegan or pescatarian diets, we can actually reduce the greenhouse gas emission by 41 or up to 75% by 2030. This does not mean that we just tell everybody you need to eat a different diet. You cannot eat what you're eating now. So this is a difficult change, behavioral change that needs to be brought about, but it needs to be brought about both from the demand side and the supply side. So on the next slide, what you just see a statement which actually says that, look, there is not one particular healthy diet. All countries have their own versions. So whether it's Thai food, or whether it's Chinese diet, Indian diet, Bangladeshi, whichever one you want to say, everybody has their own version of a traditional and healthy diet. And what is important is that we promote these diets, especially ones which are sustainable, and we can address the local barriers. In the sense, we can actually use these diets to solve the local issues related to malnutrition. At the same time, we can examine some of the trade-offs. So what impact would there be on a country, for instance, on reducing its area under a staple crop like rice, and then having more of let's say, a nutritious crop, or having, for instance, millets instead of cereals? And what would the effect on trade? What would the effect on national income? How would it influence, for instance, the people who are the farmer groups, the producers? What can be done to ensure that they still have a reasonable income from their livelihoods based on the farm, and then they're supported by social safety nets at the same time? So these are all some of the issues that need to be examined when we actually have a food system-based planning. So on the next slide, you will actually see what are the various aspects of policy options and investments for transformation of food systems. So you can see all the words that I just mentioned so far. We need policies and incentives, so to move away let's say, from staple cereals to nutrition-sensitive crops. Look at the policy across food supply chains, so efficiencies, reduction of food loss and waste, how to have, for instance, better transport so that within a city, you don't waste too much food simply by going around. In many cities, the food comes in from outside, from the rural areas, and then it goes to a central wholesale market, from where it is then sent out to other smaller markets around the city. During this time, there are all kinds, there's loss, there's waste, there are also food safety issues. So efficiencies could be increased here. Have better trade and marketing mechanisms. Now, these are a lot of these are regional issues, and particularly here, ASEAN has a very important role to play here. Social protection, we spoke about, and Thailand has been a leader on this. In fact, some of the great work in Thailand, which has occurred in nutrition, has occurred since the 70s, led by late King Bhumibol, who actually put in policies for nutrition-sensitive social protection, had volunteer groups, and many of the groups, and in the villages, there were actually nutritious crops grown, such as mung bean. So all these have really contributed to the improvement in Thailand's indicators. And therefore, Thailand has an opportunity to lead in this region and show direction to many of the other countries. Consumer-oriented policies for behavioral change. Now, this is always important. The fact that that diets need to have lower fat, sugar, salt, this is all well known. And here's where we need partnership with the private sector and with civil society. So it's not just important to say that we don't get enough nutritious food being produced. It's also we need to have the demand for it. And consumers need to be able to make these choices and influence both the private sector and the producers to produce enough to meet their choices. And then look at the dietary pattern. So this is always an important part of FAO studies in any country, to look at what are the major dietary patterns currently, what are the traditional ones, what is the dietary diversity which is available, and how some crops which have been lost could be brought back. So for instance, in countries in South Asia, leafy vegetables, and even in Thailand for that matter, leafy vegetables are extremely important in the diet, both in terms of nutrition for health and for the environment, because in many cases they can just grow with minimum resources and they can actually give a maximum impact in terms of nutrition. So these are issues which always need to be looked at in terms of the policies. On the next slide, what you can actually see is a larger picture of a food system. So this is from the GLOBPAN, which is the Global Panel on Nutrition, which is a high-level panel made up of eminent nutritionists, scientists, as well as the Director General of FAO, and who have, through this figure, put in the achieving of sustainable and healthy diets at the center of development planning, particularly in the food sector. And this is because diets not just need to be healthy, they need to be sustainable. As we said, we need to cut food loss and waste, at the same time reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time, we actually have pro-poor growth. So there are various elements which go into this. And on the next slide, what you will see is FAO's own version of the wheel, if you want to call it that. And that is all the elements of the food system that we support across countries to deliver two things. One is, of course, food security and nutrition for all. Second is to account for the economic, social, and environmental needs of future generations. So in other words, we need to produce food which delivers food security and nutrition, but at the same time is produced sustainably and incorporates resilience into livelihoods. Because we all know, due to climate change, livelihoods are at risk, particularly in agriculture, all the time. So we need to have production systems as well as food supply chains which are resilient, which can bear these shocks. And COVID is a perfect example of an unforeseen, virtually unknown shock. None of us have seen anything like this, and it hasn't happened in the last 100 years. That has taken us all, in a way, by surprise, and we need to be prepared for future such shocks in the future. On the next slide, you will actually see, well, this is again a quick summation of the situation in the Asia Pacific, but some of the other issues in the Asia Pacific that we need to tackle: water stress and scarcity, unprecedented loss of biodiversity and degradation of natural systems, and high levels of vulnerability and risk from extreme events, climate change, and of course, high levels of global greenhouse gas emissions. So the work that we are doing in many of the countries in the region. I'll just quickly go through it. One is that we are working with governments in Bangladesh and Indonesia. This is on the next slide. Let me see if are you on the right slide, please. Please go to the next slide. So you will see that we are working with governments in Bangladesh and Indonesia who are now actually moving their agriculture and food planning to being more food system based. So in other words, they are not simply saying we need to increase production every year of this crop by this much percent. They're actually saying by increasing the proportion of different crops, how much of a qualitative change will we have in nutrition outcomes, let's say in few years, let's say by 2030, what are the other changes we need to make? So for instance, for reducing food loss and waste, for increasing food safety, for increasing, let's say, the proportion of fruits and vegetables in the diet, so in terms of consumer preferences. So that's how they are looking at it, and this is happening at a very high level. In Indonesia, from Bapenas, the Planning Commission, and from Bangladesh, the Ministry of Food, which is the lead ministry. In other countries, such as where you can see, such as Pakistan, Myanmar, and the Philippines, which are more vulnerable to climatic events. For instance, Pakistan had the locust outbreak. Philippines is vulnerable to various typhoons, cyclones, even volcanoes. And likewise, Myanmar, there is also a lot of flooding and sometimes drought. The central region is very dry. Here is again, most of the policy making is now being to be fashioned around mainstreaming disaster and climate risk management in agriculture. So here's where we need to protect livelihoods all through. And then in Afghanistan, Vietnam, to actually understand the linkages. Afghanistan, as you can see, as you probably all know, it's fairly complex because of the conflict. So that puts in a layer of complexity, which is very difficult to predict. And then what are the linkages to have better agriculture and better food security and nutrition in a country which has these complex issues is another where we are looking at. So Vietnam is another example. And then on the next slide, you can actually see a graph. This is more on sort of on food loss and waste. And what you can see is the scope to actually reduce or scope to reduce increasing the production, if that's the right way to put it, so that you can actually have avoid losses at the same time you have enough food for all. And China and Thailand are extreme at the forefront in terms of food loss and waste strategies, both in the public and private sector. And likewise, you have the move towards resilience-based planning in countries like Nepal and Sri Lanka, which are also very vulnerable. So these are examples of the work that we are doing in many of these countries to have to enable the development of sustainable and resilient food systems. So to conclude this presentation, I'll just come back with, on the next slide, you can actually see some key recommendations on sustainable and healthy diets. And you can see, I will not read them all for you. You can do it at your leisure. Essentially, we have a set of recommendations for policymakers, for governments, as well as for private sector, civil society, and the donor agencies. And largely, it is focused around ensuring that the deficiencies and vulnerabilities that have been highlighted by COVID-19 are well identified. We build on existing global development targets, which are the SDGs. And of course, the climate change agreement is very important. And look at actions which can give us multiple outcomes across nutrition, health, and sustainability. So there are various advice for governments, for the private sector, which is on the next slide, on both multinationals and local companies to work closely with governments, for civil society to leverage change, because civil society are the consumers. They can hold policymakers to account through elections. And second, by influencing change through their purchasing power. So by ensuring that we purchase what is healthy, or we prefer what's healthy, rather than something which is simply has a lot of calories. And finally, for all donor agencies and development partners to ensure that this transition is socially and ethically just. We do not want to leave anyone behind. That's the underlying principle of all the SDGs, leave no one behind. So I will conclude here, and I'd like to thank you once again, the organizers, for inviting FAO and giving us the opportunity to talk about our work and to introduce the topic. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dharmapuri from Nutrition Officer, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations for an interesting talk.
Before the next session begins, let's have a short break and we'll be back in a few minutes.